Margaret went to the hospital for a final time before giving birth. She was in a lot of pain. She knew something could be wrong. Her suspicions would soon be confirmed, because after making an ultrasound, the doctor came back with a pale face. The only words Margaret heard from the doctor were, "Margaret, I'm so sorry. I've made a huge mistake. Before we start, can we get this video to 1,000 likes? Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel." The doctor panicked for quite a while. Due to his behavior, Margaret only got more stressed. She wanted to get out of bed to get more information, but the nurses stopped her from doing so. But Margaret was determined to get some answers. So after waiting for half an hour, the doctor stepped into the room. What is going on? When he finally starts to talk, all he can do is stutter. "I am so sorry." Margaret's eyes go wide and fill up with tears when her doctor speaks those dreadful words. "I have made a big mistake." But what mistake had the doctor made? Did it have something to do with the twins? Or was Margaret the one in trouble? After 3 years of trying to get pregnant, Margaret and her husband, Timothy, were prepared to hear the doctor say, "I'm sorry," one more time. Both Timothy and Margaret had undergone all kinds of tests to see if science could tell them what was wrong. After so many attempts, the only plausible explanation suggested that there was something wrong with them. The doctor greeted the couple and said, "Margaret, you're not having a child, you're having twins." She and Timothy just couldn't believe it. 1 month before giving birth to her twins, Margaret was watching TV when suddenly she started to experience painful stomach cramps. Nervous that something might be wrong with her babies, she called Timothy and told him she was feeling the worst abdominal pain she has ever had. He rushed to their home to pick her up. They had decided to pay the doctor an extra visit so Margaret could describe her symptoms, hoping that he knew what was going on. The small hospital was swamped, and their doctor had to see Margaret at his lunch break due to his busy schedule. The doctor was a bit agitated and in a rush. Margaret described all her symptoms and worries while he was listening to the abdomen with a stethoscope. After pressing some parts of her abdomen with his fingers, the doctor concluded that there was nothing to worry about. He was quite certain that the stomach cramps may have been caused by food poisoning or stress. The doctor excused himself and left in a hurry. Margaret and Timothy were left feeling worried. The doctor's rush made them feel uneasy, as they thought he wasn't even paying attention to Margaret when she was describing her symptoms. They decided to go home and trust the doctor. Over the following weeks, the pain continued to shoot up her stomach. As the days passed, the frequency and intensity just increased. At this point, both Margaret and Timothy were really worried. Margaret decided that she would not go to the hospital this time. She would try to reach her doctor on the phone. She did not have to wait for that much. When the doctor picked up and heard the same woman's symptoms, he tried to calm her down. He insisted on stress being the cause of all of her pains. But the day Margaret was expected to give birth, the pains suddenly stopped. By this point, Margaret and Timothy were on the phone with the doctor daily, and while he had tried to comfort them for the first 2 weeks, he was seemingly starting to worry a bit himself. Had he actually missed something? What were the consequences of his possible mistake? However, there was something he could do. The doctor was then a bit more worried. With no hesitation, he contacted Margaret to check up on her. The pain hadn't returned, so that was a good sign. What was not a good sign was the fact that she hadn't gone into labor, so the doctor gave her some tips on how to induce labor naturally. However, the tranquility would not last longer as a shooting pain began right in her stomach. Apparently, it had worked. She was going into labor. When Timothy realized what was going on, he immediately put on some clothes and helped Margaret to get in the car. Once in the car, they kissed and left for the hospital. When they arrived, the labor and delivery rooms were waiting for her. Luckily, he had called in advance, as it would turn out they barely had a second to spare. From there on, things seemed to happen really fast. After being in the room for less than 10 minutes, one of the babies started crowing. They had to do this now, and a doctor was called to come help. Timothy and Margaret had not been in the hospital room for more than 10 minutes when it happened. It was a kind of crowing that filled the room, coming from one of the babies. The couple looked each other in the eyes. They both knew that this had to happen now. Luckily, one of the nurses seemed determined, and a doctor was called upon to come and help. When they arrived, The labor and delivery rooms were waiting for her. Luckily, he had called in advance, as it would turn out they barely had a second to spare. From there on, things seemed to happen really fast. They both knew that this had to happen now. Luckily, one of the nurses seemed determined, and a doctor was called upon to come and help. The doctor came with a fast stride from around the corner, surprising Timothy by first sight. The two of them realized in that moment that they had been in contact before, the moment when this doctor had so rudely brushed Margaret's concerns aside a few months ago. Was this a coincidence? How was this doctor still allowed to help them in this critical phase? He knew that there was little time left and actions needed to be taken with speed. There was probably nobody else that was capable of helping in time. Timothy naturally kept a close eye on the doctor in the steps that followed. Things went a little smoother from here. Within half an hour after the doctor had arrived, the first baby was already born. Timothy held the newborn. He could barely believe that he was looking at his own child. They quickly cut the umbilical cord, and after he gave the baby to a nurse standing next to him. However, the work here was not yet done. Of course, there was the second one that was entering the world now. As is often with twins, the second one is the one that comes with more trouble. Margaret really was exhausted at this point, but she kept her energy running with the thought that she did not want to have a C-section. This kept her going through the end, and finally, the second baby started crowing. A feeling of relief came over her. There was the second child that the couple had put on this earth at last. They were born and Margaret had accomplished the mission. She could now finally surrender to her exhaustion. They held the second baby for a brief moment before it was quickly taken by the nurse, as well to do a couple of standard tests. Now, it was Timothy that had an additional request. Timothy's issue with this was that he did not want the doctor to know about the special request, as he still did not fully trust him. His fear was that the doctor might not take his worries seriously like he did last time. The doctor could brush the additional test to the side as an unnecessary cost or something like that. Timothy told this to the nurses, explaining the previous experience he had with this doctor. The nurses discussed it among themselves and eventually decided to do what Timothy had asked. While the nurses went on to do their test, Timothy quickly returned to his wife to comfort her. Time slowly passed, minute by minute, until only after more than 2 hours, someone knocked on the door. The restless husband and wife surely expected a couple of nurses to walk in, bringing the babies with them and handing them over. Instead, when the room finally opened, this turned out to be a false prediction. In fact, Timothy and Margaret were confronted by a sight that they did not expect at all. The restless husband and wife surely expected a couple of nurses to walk in, bringing the babies with them and handing them over. Instead, when the room finally opened, this turned out to be a false prediction. In fact, Timothy and Margaret were confronted by a sight that they did not expect at all. It was not actually a nurse that got in, but a man in a doctor's uniform. The doctor that appeared that had helped Margaret before with the delivery as well as before. The doctor that they knew very well, but also the doctor that they did not fully trust. He was here now with an unrested expression. Timothy and Margaret knew instantly that something was wrong. He could barely look the couple in the eyes. The doctor seemed stern and confident enough in the times that they had interacted before, but now it was like he was another person. But before Timothy or Margaret could say anything or ask what was going on, the doctor started stuttering, saying, I'm so sorry. No more than these words were needed to make the husband and wife feel their whole world collapsing. Timothy immediately felt as if something was terribly wrong with the babies. How could it be the extra tests were just requested to be extra sure? It turned out that Timothy was only partly right. The checkup resulted in the conclusion that the twins had caught a bacteria during Margaret's pregnancy. The doctor announced this with a terribly serious tone. If Timothy would not have had this voice in his head telling him that an extra checkup was necessary, they could have been out of this room by now. If they would have been let go, the situation would have been very problematic. Fortunately, as the nurses had discovered it now, the bacteria could be rather easily treated, and the babies should not experience damage for the rest of their lives. They came to the conclusion that most likely the bacteria was caught in relation to Margaret's stomach cramps. The doctor was very aware of the fact that he had to a great extent ignored these complaints all these months ago. He truly felt terrible about this. Making such a mistake was unforgivable, so he thought. The doctor's attitude from before was very close to causing disastrous consequences. Only because Timothy had had a feeling of distrust towards him, it was avoided. The doctor stood there now, shamefully and with tears in his eyes, asking whether the couple would ever be able to forgive him for his deeds. One might expect that Timothy and Margaret would have a problem forgiving the doctor. Instead, they were just over the moon that their baby twins were healthy and unharmed. As they had waited in extreme tension for so long, now finally the weight of the world fell off their shoulders. A weight also fell off the doctor's shoulders, and he promised himself that his attitude would very much change from now on. The moment finally came that Timothy and Margaret walked out of the hospital's front doors the following week. They were tired, but most of all very happy. In the weeks that came after, it turned out that no further health issues followed from the bacteria. The family was very much looking forward to spend the rest of their lives together.